Okay, welcome. And thank you everyone for taking the time to learn more about preparing your child for post-secondary education. So this year's virtual webinar series was a collaborative effort with Northern Lights Interagency Council, along with the Interagency Council of Duluth. Because we haven't had the opportunity to be in person with the pandemic, we wanted to still continue to provide information to parents regarding topics related to transition planning and preparing your child for their future. So we have a ton of information on our website in terms of the remaining sessions coming up through the month of April, along with any handouts and presentations that presenters have shared since the beginning of this in February. So please make sure to check that information out as well. So without further ado, we are extremely happy to have Emily, Stacy, Hannah, and Nancy from our area post-secondary institutes here to present to you regarding preparing your child for post-secondary education. Thank you.
So I guess, I will start. I know Nancy's name is first, but
oh, sorry.
No, it doesn't matter actually. So I am Stacy Langguth, and I am a disability specialist at Lake Superior College.
I'm Nancy Olsen. I'm academic advisor and the disability coordinator at Fond du Lac Tribal and Community College.
Hi everyone, my name is Emily Norenberg. I'm the director for disability resources at the UMD campus.
Hi everyone, I'm Hannah Richards. I am the interim assistant director for the Center for Equal Access at the College of St. Scholastica.
So I can, I guess, just tee up some of our conversation for today. Our goal and our hope is to cover a few different topics during our session today, starting with taking a closer look at some of the differences between high school and college. After that, we'll have a little bit of a conversation around reasonable accommodations. And then we'll look at admission requirements. Before we close out, Nancy has some wonderful resources and links that she'll include. And then we'll have questions, time for questions. But I just wanted to share too, as we were kind of envisioning our session, we would like to have a pretty informal conversation. And so folks have questions that come up along the way. I think it's totally fair just to jump in with those questions. If you prefer to hold them into the end, we're really happy just to do whatever to make sure that you walk away feeling like you are receiving the information and answers that you hope to get out of this session. So like I said, we'll kick off with some of those differences, and we don't really have a particular speaking order. We haven't really assigned any presentation duties among the group here, and so we're just going to kind of chip in with our thoughts and experiences around these various topics. So I can, just for the purpose of getting things moving, one of the differences that we see between high school and college centers around documentation. We find in the high school setting that documentation really has a focus on eligibility for services, whereas in college, the documentation that we are looking for talks about specific functional limitations, barriers to access, and how those documented limitations or barriers translate into a requirement for accommodation as a matter of access. I'll stop there and let someone else perhaps talk about kind of IEP and 504 and how that transitions or doesn't into the collegiate setting.
I can take that. So IEPs and 504 plans are typically what you have in your high school career. As we move to post-secondary settings, those don't transfer, although they do qualify as the documentation we can take. Those accommodations don't automatically apply to college. There are ones that aren't reasonable for college that you may have had in the high school setting. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a couple slides from now, I believe. The biggest thing is, so colleges fall under the American Disabilities Act and Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act, whereas K-12 schools follow the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. So it's a little bit different on, you know, what rules there are and what expectations there are between college and high school, which I think we'll get into later too. Anything Nancy or Stacy want to add?
I'll add something. When it talks about for documentation for college, looking at specific functional limitations, what I think is pretty common for, at least is for Fond du Lac, but I think is pretty common with all of us, is what we really like to see is like a 3-year review IEP, which usually is the document that will actually share how the disability was assessed and give more information, so we know what might be some considerations for what accommodations would be best. So, because I know a few times I've gotten just an initial IEP that's just a regular yearly one, and sometimes it has pretty limited information. It somewhat depends on the school district, and so that 3-year review one is very helpful.
So I can, oh, go ahead,
okay.
Nancy.
Oh, I was going to say, I can go ahead and share on this one. When it comes to requesting accommodations, a key difference is in high school, the student is usually identified by the school and is supported by parents and teachers. So students often, a teacher will indicate that there's some concerns with the student, or a parent will call the school or email or and talk to teachers, that type of thing. College, the student really has to self-identify to their disability office on campus. We don't have a way of knowing, and many students that had accommodations through a 504 or IEP in high school do not self-identify, which can be a problem because then they're not getting their services that could really help them. So the responsibility at the high school, primary responsibility for advocacy typically is with the parent and or the school. Often, you know, they have a special, obviously a special education case manager or something like that that's doing a lot of advocacy. In college, it's definitely up to the student to self-advocate and arrange accommodations. Belongs to the student, so the student has to speak up and let us know what they need and actually make that initial contact.
And I would just add on that identification part of it. It's not uncommon for some students to come in and have an established relationship with disability resources, or have a history of accessing disability support. And so there are some students who absolutely enter into the college setting and are prepared to immediately connect with the disability resources office and keep that relationship moving forward. But I think that identity piece becomes very important in college, where students often look to college as an opportunity to kind of revise their identity or step forward on a different foot. And so at least at UMD, we do work with a fair amount of students who find their way to us later on, perhaps not right away at the start of their fall semester during their freshman year. It might be later in the fall semester, it might be in the spring, it might even be in their sophomore year of college, where they needed some time to kind of square who they are as an individual and what are the supports that they need. And I think there's a decent amount of students who want to shed that kind of special education past, and they need to chart their own path forward. And so in those instances, you know, as a parent, it's kind of this both and of understanding where your student is in their identity development and also wanting to support them and nudge them in the right direction, but ultimately that students bear that responsibility to identify and request accommodations, and that doesn't always align with what they want to do and perhaps what their family or support system wants them to do.
We often too have students that will request accommodations one semester and then won't request, even if when I've reached out to them, they don't necessarily request again. And as a parent, I am a parent of a college student who has a couple of different disabilities. And one of the things I'm aware of is encouraging her to speak up and say what she needs and think about each semester what services she might need or what she may need to do herself to be as successful as possible. And so that's a role, I think, for parents that's is a good one to recognize their increasing independence, but also kind of, well, what do you think about this? Or do you think it would be helpful to seek out an accommodation related to that type of thing?
Before we move on from this slide, I just wanted to add that although it does fall on the student to self-identify with disability resources, sometimes they identify with a different department on campus, whether it's their faculty or they're, youth and counseling services, different departments like that, where they make that identification and then are referred to our office, which, we work closely with everybody on campus to make those referrals, but it still then falls back on the students to follow through where, we can make that reach out after a referral of, hey, we heard you may be interested in some accommodations, but then it falls on the student to follow through with submitting any forms necessary and meeting with our office.
And I would like to add, I always tell my students that we're a support resource on campus. And so anything that we set up in the beginning of a semester, it's not like, okay, see you next semester. We're ongoing. And if there's ever any struggles throughout the semester, to always, self-advocate and reach out so that we can help navigate. Maybe we need to come up with different accommodation plans, depending on the courses that they're taking. Because it'll vary from the courses that they're taking to what accommodations are going to best suit their needs.
Sorry, skipped a slide there. I can start with this one. We've talked already a lot about building those self-advocacy skills, and that in college, the students have to advocate for themselves, where in high school, parents in the schools did that part or had more access in that part. One thing with college that's different than high school is parents don't automatically have access to students' records. The student does have to give written permission or sign a FERPA release for parents to have access to their records and find out certain information, unlike high school where the parents had full access to everything and participated in the accommodation process. That, some places or some disability resource offices will allow parents to participate with that student's permission, but other times it's the student it's just the student we meet with. And if the parent does join the meeting, we still want the student to lead the meeting. We don't want the parent to just tell us what the student needs, because the student, should be advocating for themselves. They're the ones that are going to be continuing to work with our offices. The other thing is in structures and working with professors and teachers where in high school, teachers kind of are those ones that identify if there's assistance. In college, sometimes faculty do identify it and make that referral, but typically, faculty aren't the ones to officiate it, but they can.
I would just add in a few additional thoughts. Self-advocacy is a skill set that's learned over time. And I think all four of us on this presentation side of the house, we don't necessarily have an expectation that students come in with a well-defined skill set. We always appreciate it. And certainly the things that schools and families can do to support their students in building their skills is really helpful. But, it's not uncommon that we might work with a student to kind of ask a lot of questions and kind of build their skills over time and eventually get to a place where they can articulate, I'm in this type of class that presents this type of barriers and these type of accommodations are effective. And, a great starting off point, of course, we've all heard the notion that if a high school student can run their own IEP meeting, that's really a delight. I think that's a great safe place to practice those skills. I also often will ask students to identify kind of what are their strengths as a learner and what concerns do they bring into a setting, and what accommodations have been really helpful for them in the past? So those are some basic questions that I engage with students around. And I also just want to say a little bit more about access to records. Most students that I work with, we have an online accommodation request form, and that's how students initially connect with our office. And most students in that type of setting aren't necessarily filling out that release of information that gives me permission to speak with parents. I can listen, and I'm pretty upfront with parents about that, that I don't have a release, and I'm happy to hear their concerns, but I really can't provide any information back. When students do sign a release, I can only really give information around disability accommodations and access decisions that are made in our office. I don't have access to faculty records. I can't see grade books to disclose grading information. And a lot of the time when I'm working with students and parents, and I do have that release of information, I will give some information, but I always encourage the family to go back to the student to receive that information just from their perspective, because I think that's an important skill for students to be able to build, and that's a way I can help them practice that skill.
I can jump in on this one. With reasonable accommodations, modifications in high school, teachers can actually change curriculum or alternate the pace that a student goes through on assignments to help them be successful. In college, professors are not required to modify instruction or alter assignments. So that's a big change for students. Many times students will ask me right off the bat, can they have less, on multiple choice, only have a couple choices on a multiple choice test, or can they be exempted from certain assignments? And that just is not something that happens in college. And I know from students I've worked with that have had quite an extensive amount of accommodations in high school. Some of the changes can be pretty challenging. Format and grading changes in high school, either IEP or 504 plan, can have those kind of modifications to the test format or grading. And in college, grading and exam format changes are not generally available. Accommodations for how exams are given are available and supported by disability documentation. So the idea of being able to have extended time on a test or have a quiet space to take an exam are allowed, but not changes to the test itself.
Does anyone have anything to add before I advance the slide?
I'd like to just add something as the secondary transition coordinator. I work with a lot of teams and really encourage them, especially that 11th and 12th grade year, if they truly have a goal of going to a post-secondary institute, is to mirror those accommodations while in high school, to kind of get used to that and familiar while you have that safety net. And then looking at students that maybe utilize a paraprofessional to look at if their goal is to look at post-secondary education, kind of pulling back on those resources and services as well. So they're not kind of hit, with a wall as they enter college with, well, how come I don't have this person next to me? And why don't I get, a 50-50 on this test? Or how come I can't cut this in half? So really encouraging those teams to look at mirroring what's offered at that post-secondary level is important, I think. Thank you.
So some commonly used accommodations in college. I guess before we get into this, these are done on a case by case, which it says, based on what the student presents or what the documentation presents. Accommodations in college are designed to reduce or eliminate disability-related barriers to access. It's an interactive process with the student and determining what are those barriers, how can we mitigate them. and, what each course looks like too. So some accommodations may apply to specific classes, but not other ones. Or for some students, they may need specific accommodations for specific subjects, but not other subjects, which is why that interactive process is really important, because it's not a cookie cutter. We don't just apply all of the same accommodations to everybody with the same disability. Every student is different, and what their barriers they experience are different. And even it may be a similar barrier, but it's impacting them a different way.
And I would say it's frequent that we'll work with families, and as students are what I would call a prospective student, they're kind of exploring colleges and thinking about, a particular institution or 2 or 3 or 4. And so for many folks, part of that process includes meeting with the Disability Support Office to get a sense of like, how could this office support my student? And so often folks will ask, my son or daughter has diagnosed condition X, Y, or Z, what accommodations do they get? And the answer that I will give is it depends. And that's not me or any college trying to be slippery or squishy. It's just truly that accommodation decisions are based on a range of contextual factors that some of those things we'll know in advance, right? Like we'll know what are the students' strengths in areas of concern and diagnosed conditions. The other factors that we won't necessarily know until feet are on the ground would be what barriers present in a particular class. So if I have a reading specific disability, that might show up in class X, Y, and Z. But depending on the design or the content of another class, those barriers may not emerge. And so I may need accommodations in a specific setting, but perhaps not elsewhere. And so I think that's what colleges are often trying to illustrate to prospective students and families, is that there's a series of factors that have to be weighed. But we can talk then generally about what accommodations might be helpful based on the information they're sharing at the point of that meeting. Nancy, it looks like you're adding, but you might be on, I know you're on mute.
Sorry about that. What I find is many times students will say, well, I think I just need, excuse me, extended time on tests. And then they get a few weeks into a class and go, yes, this is somewhat of an issue and this is an issue and that type of thing. And so it's really important to, and I think we all do that, is to encourage students to keep in touch with us and keep letting us know if what's going on is working or not. We also have, like on our campus, and I know several of the campuses do have like TRIO program, and they will have some additional services that are available to their TRIO students that we can get our students connected to. And so, and our tutoring center and things like that. And so many times if students, we'll let them know about those things ahead of time, but if they don't let us know that maybe they're needing that, sometimes they need kind of the help getting hooked up with the tutoring center or something like that. And so really important to, have them keep in touch with us during the semester.
So I haven't really piped in much, but I can touch on this slide here. So as you can tell, there are differences between high school accommodations, modifications versus college. So as you can see the list here, these are kind of commonly used accommodations. I know at least for my, at LSE, one of the most common ones is the exam accommodations. So a lot of times students will get distracted in the classroom environment. So we provide a less distracting environment, can provide more time to take the test, different note-taking supports. So we, a lot of times we want students to be as independent as possible. So we'll kind of have a discussion about what are the note-taking needs? Are there different types of software that we could use, check out recorders for recording lectures, or do we need to go down the path and have another classmate actually take notes during class and provide them to the student? Reading accommodations. So a lot of times if students were used to having tests read to them in high school, sometimes that can differ because there may be an actual person reading those tests, but in college, at least at LSE, we have different software that's a text-to-speech. So for exams, we'd scan the test in and it would read it to the student. Books and alternative format with a different reading software that we can provide, ASL interpreting, assistive technology. We don't have housing, so I haven't really done, a lot with the housing and dining accommodations. But of course, those are provided for, the colleges and universities that do have housing. But, those are the main ones. I know a lot of times too, like we can get different ergonomic keyboards, or if a student needs a different type of chair in a classroom, just kind of those various things. But really it's up to what the students' needs are, what their barriers are, so we can create, provide them access.
I would also just add in an additional thought. We don't compel students to use any particular accommodations. And so we may meet with students and talk about what barriers they experience. We may discuss some ideas of what reasonable accommodations may exist for those particular series of circumstances. And then really the student gets to make that decision about what accommodations they do or do not use. And folks fall into a range of options there, right? There are some students who kind of, particularly if they have experience using accommodations, they may say X, Y, and Z works for me. Let's throw everything at this. And I think there are other students who prefer to take a more metered approach to say, well, I'll try this accommodation, but I'm going to hold on these other ones for now. There's other students who are meeting with us for the purposes of gathering information, and they may make no decisions to use accommodations at that point. They may wish to just be aware of the options that are available and then get further into it and make some decisions about what will and will not work for them or what may or may not be necessary. So it's really student choice is honored above all else.
So if
I can, I'm sorry, why don't you go ahead, Hannah?
okay. So we've kind of touched on a few of these of, accommodations that generally aren't reasonable in the college setting. So reducing assignment lengths, reducing choices on multiple choice exams, exam retakes, waiving assignment, waiving course requirements. Accommodations aren't retroactive, so they don't apply to anything prior to being set up with accommodations. In a college setting, paraprofessionals aren't something that we're able to give out or support. And then open-ended deadlines for assignments aren't something that are typically given. Those ones can quickly lead to the snowball effect with students where, they start to be behind and then they become very behind because of the accommodation. So it's not addressing that barrier. These are just some of them. There are times that exceptions are made, but these typically aren't reasonable.
I think we would go back to the idea, right, that it's a case-by-case basis. So there's, Hannah had mentioned that there's really no cookie cutter approach to accommodations. We're always compelled to engage in the interactive process and make case-by-case decisions. So the road takes us in unexpected directions, and that's really fine for us to travel down those roads together in the destination of equal access. So Nancy, did you have some comments as well around the accommodations that are general?
The one I was going to mention, right. The one I was going to mention is that speaking from a parent perspective, one of the things that I regret now, but at the time I was appreciative of, is my daughter was struggling with some mental health issues junior and senior year. And so they were bending over backwards to give her, she was able to take tests home and take them. She was able to use both her books and notes. And all of that, I think, was just to help with anxiety that she was struggling with. But what happened is she really didn't know how to take tests without using all the materials. And so it wound up leading to a tougher transition into college. And so what I think a lot of the schools are doing, which is great, is encouraging, again, as the students are moving towards junior, senior year, is having them become more independent and not using some of those accommodations that they've had. But I really encourage that direction, because it can make it a rocky choice. And I've seen that with some of the students I've worked with too, that they've had enough flexibility in their classes straight through that it's just a real rude awakening to suddenly have to take a test or and not be able to have anything other than more time. I'll jump in since I'm first on admissions requirements. Both FDLTCC and LSC have more, the community colleges in the state of Minnesota have pretty open admission policies. And so we require minimally a high school transcript or a GED. And right now, because of coronavirus, we're not doing Accuplacer testing on campus. And so we're using more of a looking at high school GPA, what classes students have taken, particularly in math and English, if they have Accuplacers they've taken previously, or if they've taken an ASCT, SAT, or the MCA test that they've done in high school, looking at those for placement in particularly in math and English, but they're not used for acceptance into college.
So, yep, I mean, granted, we are the same admissions requirements. I will also add, I mean, because we do take into account all of the scores, what testing they had previously. But because now with COVID, we've also added this self-guided assessment. So it's basically this document that a student would go through and kind of see where they would place themselves as far as English and math. So that could be another factor.
I'll talk a little bit about UMD's admission requirements. We do require high school transcripts and completion of high school preps, which are listed on the screen. 4 years English, 4 years math, including 1 year of geometry, 2 years of algebra, one of which must be an advanced or intermediate algebra class, 3 years science, 3 years social studies, 2 years world language. ASL is considered a world language. I know that can be a consideration for students with specific learning disabilities. Acquiring a second language can be very difficult, but we do accept ASL as a second language in 1 year art. Starting this year, maybe it was last spring, I don't honestly recall, but UMD moved to a test optional approach. So students are not required to have ACT or SAT scores. That's in part due to COVID and the challenges of accessing exams like that in our COVID moment. But also I think it's a longer term commitment to be test optional, because there are some barriers that are introduced with the requirement of ACT or SAT scores. I can also say just a little bit about, as a person who works just on the periphery of admissions, and our work intersects just often enough, I know that admissions engages in what they call like a holistic review of a student's application. So they're looking at a multitude of factors, not just GPA and academic achievements. They're looking at what are the other leadership things, what are the other factors that go into a student's application, and what is the overall body of evidence that would help the admissions review team determine whether or not the student is ready to be successful at UMD. That's really what we're looking at, is what evidence would lead us to believe that the student could come to UMD and find success, because college is expensive and we want students to come here and achieve the goals and the things that they set out to achieve.
Yeah, so Scholastica has a similar holistic approach as UMD, where they look at everything. What we do require is the high school transcript or a GED. We have been test optional for a couple years now, where in replace of the exams or the ACT or SAT, you can write an essay describing your overall academic accomplishments. And then they look at, participation in leadership skills, extracurricular activities, community services, church, any other personal enrichment activities. Community is a huge thing at Scholastica, and is one of our Benedictine values. So that's why we focus on those. Things is just because that's the community we have here, and a part of our values. The one thing I did not add is, so we don't have a world language requirement to be accepted, but we do have one to graduate, where you do have to complete, I think, a year of a world language. We do include ASL here as well, in the college setting, or if you brought in 2 years from high school, it would satisfy that 1 year of college level credit.
What I picked out is just a few links to articles that, as a parent of a young adult with disabilities, I think are really helpful. A lot of it is focusing on self-advocacy. I particularly, the first one I said, go out and look at the link. There's a really interesting article about a student who was challenged by a faculty member about her disability and how she advocated for her rights, and then talking about, kind of all the ways she's worked through to succeed in college, the video was very inspiring. The couple of these are more about executive function, and executive function can be an issue for students who have ADHD, are on the autism spectrum, struggle with anxiety, a variety of other areas. And so that was something I didn't know that much about a number of years ago. And I see, at least at Fond du Lac, I see a lot of our students struggling with executive function, things like time management and organizational skills, and struggles with working memory that can be part of some disabilities. And so I think the information out there is great. I just picked a few. There's lots of good information out there, and parents play such an important role in helping their students along with the schools and their special ed staff members work on those skills. And the more they do them, I think, or work on those and get more proficient at them in middle school or high school, I think the more successful students are apt to be in college. So I think we're at the point kind of questions, and we've got our contact information all here. Could either unmute and ask questions, or if you want to put anything in the chat, that would be great.